France has announced a package of measures to boost green industries and provide more support to domestic businesses.
In a New Year address, the Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire also said Europe needed to do more to counter a United States spending plan, which threatens to drain investment out of the EU and into the US.
We will continue to call for European interests to be better taken into account as the American Inflation Reduction Act is being implemented. We will go to Washington with the German finance minister in February to continue asking for that.
Well, let's talk to Hosuk Lee-Makiyama from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Welcome back to the programme. Good to have you with us. So these French measures seem to be aimed at countering President Biden's spending plan. Is Europe right to be worried about this?
Well, to be fair, Europe and the United States always had a very uneasy commercial rivalry, but I think that the Inflation Reduction Act really takes the animosity to a completely new level on both practical terms and ideological terms, because I think from the viewpoint of the European leaders, perhaps the Biden administration has perhaps used or abused the China threat or even the greening economy as a pretext to systematically go after Europe. And whatever technological economic advantage that Europe may have or had, especially against French, German, and Scandinavian companies in manufacturing, have been basically targeted in these measures. It's very difficult to see it from a different perspective from, at least from a European leader.
So does this look like the start of a trade war to you, especially if other EU countries come up with their own spending plans?
Well, I would argue that the trade war has been pretty much constant noise or background noise since 1968, but I think it is fairly true that, Biden administration has not been a particular improvement to Trump Section 232 tariffs, for example, on steel. But this goes straight to the heart of Europe for a number of reasons. One is for the practical reasons that I mentioned, that it really singles out the European primary sectors of comparative advantage, but also how the U.S. Congress didn't actually allow Biden's trade agency scrub the text for very obvious and, in my view, very unnecessary violation of international trade rules. We have to remember that Europe is by default multilateralist. It really believes in the rules. And in other words, the United States have basically doubled down and said that, we don't really care about rules. And the U.S. Trade Representative, Biden's head trade negotiator, Catherine Tai, has even defended these violations, which she was not even allowed to review ahead of their publication. And it simply encouraged the EU to commit same violation against in its own IRA-type subsidies. So I think we see something that goes really beyond the usual commercial conflict that we see across the Atlantic.
But Joe Biden has suggested he could make tweaks to soften the scheme's impact on European businesses. What kind of things could he do?
Well, on the auto sector, I think it could be fairly easy to redraft. And I think also the U.S. Treasury has made a statement saying that any country that has a trade agreement could be exempt from these exclusions, from these subsidies. So, for example, countries like Korea, but also countries like South Africa, where Volkswagen and other major manufacturers happens to have plants, could be used instead of Europe as a production plant in order to export to the United States, and they could still qualify for the subsidies. However, I think that the main point here is not just a question about inclusion of autos or not, but if you look at what's going to happen, for example, in the area of hydrogen and energy, we are going to see substantial subsidies, both on the biocide credits, together with preferences for investment and production tax credits that has been agreed already last year, which could basically bring the energy costs down to zero. And that basically means that the United States will have a manufacturing competitive advantage against Europe across a number of areas that is energy dependent, while the energy prices in Europe is spiking due to the war.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because as you point out, the US has much lower energy costs than the EU. Can it really compete? It's not a level playing field, is it?
No, I mean, there is no such a thing as a level playing field. Every country and every, geography is different in terms of comparative advantages, but I have to say that not every country is actually going to be affected, and not every European country is actually export-led. And not every country has actually the fiscal firepower to spend towards either industrial subsidies or market intervention and energy prices. But we are very likely to see, for example, from Germany, an attempt to level the playing field when it comes to energy cost, because it can't do much else. It has already slashed the real wages. Its workers has already taken a toll for the last 20 years. It has already adjusted its cost. It has moved much of its production abroad in order to keep the production plants and the jobs at home. A German socialist leader would have to do something in order to keep its manufacturing base going. And second, I think we are very likely to see that Europe will loosen its disciplines on subsidies. And because, in fact, industrial subsidies in Europe are forbidden. There is a very stringent state aid subsidies going towards European companies, which a number of European countries will now actually ask for revision in order to engage in similar policies themselves. And last and foremost, perhaps in this context, EU and Japan, the United States will have no inclination to coordinate against Chinese industrial subsidies that were actually deemed to distort the markets for the last 10, 20 years. That has been their number one complaint. I think that complaint is pretty much out of the window by now.
Hosuk Lee-Makiyama from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Great to get your thoughts today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.